we subsidize non-resident students at quite a clip. And you know what Dr. Vedder's study shows that the North Dakota Policy Council Commission is that we're not getting a bang for our buck, and those students are just leaving for various number of reasons. But the bottom line is that they're not staying here, and that the people that are getting jobs here and staying here are in areas and industries that politicians don't subsidize nearly as much.
What strikes me as particularly odious about this whole arrangement is that, really this is happening at a time when some areas of North Dakota, that a lot of us would describe as necessary, perfectly prudent spending have gone neglected. For instance, I'm talking about the roads and bridges in the western part of the state, which have gone neglected. We've been doing that even as we've been pouring this money into higher education. And also on the flip side of it, for all the money we've been putting in education, I seem to remember during the legislative session hearing a lot of heated rhetoric coming out of the higher education system in the state, talking about how they were going to have to shut down core academic programs if they didn't get more money, and their feet were on the edge of a cliff, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, when you're hearing all that and you juxtapose it next to the situation we have here where we're subsidizing all these out-of-state students, it kind of seems like the taxpayers are getting milked here.
Well, I think this is universal among bureaucrats, is that when faced with cuts, everyone says, well, we're going to cut the police department, we're going to cut the roads, and all that kind of stuff, but they never cut where the actual fat is, like you just pointed out, which is in the budgets like the higher ed budget. So when when people who think more like we do get attacked or criticized for saying, well, we want to cut spending, well, that means we want to cut roads and police departments and that kind of thing. It's just patently false, but it's the only arrow that those bureaucrats have. Unfortunately, a lot of the times it tends to work.
I asked Dr. Vedder this question. I want to ask it of you. Do you think this is all just empire building? This is just because the Wall Street Journal sort of alludes to it. They talk about how we were running low on graduates from our K-12 system, so we poured money into higher education to attract these students from out of state. Is this basically just empire building? Is this really just about packing students in no matter how we do it so that we don't have to downsize the universities?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are some economies of scale at play here where, we can't just shut down universities without, striking them from the Constitution, which is quite a process. And the local constituencies, the places that have universities are the places where there are the most voters. So doing that would be very hard to do. But so what they try to do is they try to fill up all their buildings full of students, and they practically have to beg students to come here by offering them relatively cheap tuition, and then cutting it even lower with tuition waivers and scholarships and all those kinds of things when those students don't stay in North Dakota long term. So yes, so the question to ask is, well, why do we need those buildings to fill up then? And I think to answer your question, yes, it's empire building, because that's all they seem to do. At a time when businesses, Fortune 500 companies, big companies are trying to embrace technology and use technology to become more efficient and to communicate across the entire globe, our university system seems to just want to keep building brick-and-mortar buildings, and I think that it just exemplifies the difference between a for-profit industry, a for-profit business, and a college university.
855-200-1776 if you want to join the program, talking with the North Dakota Policy Council Executive Director, Brett Narloch. Brett, the other day I was reading a report that was put out by the North Dakota University System, and I think it really speaks to the mentality at the university system that you and I are talking about, which is essentially just, do whatever it takes to pack as many students into these schools as we can so we can brag about, breaking enrollment records and that every year. And, what was interesting to me is that they referred to the North Dakota University system and the North Dakota education system in general as our education pipeline. And to me, I think that if they have that mentality, if they're thinking this is a pipeline or an assembly line, well, then that's it. It's like they just want to stuff massive quantities of something in one end and pump out massive quantities of it on the other end without really a lot of concern about what happens in the meantime.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I think it was a year or two ago, the president of UND said that the number one goal of his administration, I think it was to increase enrollment. But it seemed like it was just for the sake of increasing enrollment, as if having larger numbers of students makes them smarter. Which is certainly not the case. All it does is it gets them a bigger budget, which is, of course, generally speaking, what bureaucrats like, and that is bigger budgets. And so they'll naturally do whatever it takes to increase the size of those budgets. Whatever happens to the quality of education, I guess, becomes a secondary issue.
Well, I think that's an attitude that permeates the higher education. It's a problem in higher education outside of just North Dakota. I think we've got just in it seems to be the metric that we have for success with higher education policy in this country is how many students are we sending to college. Nobody seems to be asking, is the training these kids are getting at college helpful in finding a career? Are they more academically advanced when they come out of the universities? Is the education worth the amount of debt that they're getting themselves into by obtaining that education? I think those are questions that we're not asking. Instead, we're just looking, well, we sent X number of kids to college, therefore those kids must be smarter and are going to get better careers and make more money. And I think there's an assumption there that I think assumes facts, not an evidence.
Yeah, that's right. And Dr. Richard Vetter, who we just had on, has done. He's almost made a career out of trying to answer those very questions you asked. But I would even add one more on top of it, of that list that you made, and that's to say, how do we even know that the students that are going to college are ready for college? If you look at how many remedial classes are offered at universities. It keeps growing and growing and growing. So what that also suggests is, hey, let's lower our standards to get enrollment levels up. But what that does is it increases the cost to taxpayers, of course, because it's bigger enrollment, so that costs more for taxpayers. But it also, I think it hurts students because they're trying to force them into situations where they perhaps don't belong, or perhaps they should go right to the workforce or to some other technical training or something like that, as opposed to just going to UND or NDSU. But I think, at least my experience, was that every step up the K-12 ladder, you're funneled one way, and that's just the way that the counselors and the K-12 system and the higher ed system wants it, which is, hey, let's all go to a 4-year college, whether we need to or not, whether we're qualified to be there or not, and then we'll milk you for 4 years, 5 years of tuition, and then send you out into the workforce. And that's that pipeline mentality that you brought up just a couple minutes ago.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that more of that pipeline mentality. Brett, I want to go to a break, and when we come back, I want to talk to you about your legislative ranking. So be ready with that. We're going to talk about that right after this break. I'm Rob Port, sitting in for the chairman, Scott Hennon, on the Scott Hennon Show. Your call-in number is 855-200-1776. We'll be back right after this, so go away. And, Brett, I wanted to ask you guys about your new North Dakota legislative review. And really, this is the second one of these reports that you've put out, right? Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, that's right. What we are trying to do is come up with a way to objectively look at how the state legislature performed, separating the record from the rhetoric, we like to say. And so what we did is we took our policy guide, which is called Moving Forward, and which we released in, I believe it was August of 2010. We took all the bills from the 2007 and 11 legislative session, and that exemplified ideas in our policy guide, and matched that up with every legislator's voting records, and they kind of come up with a score that was the first half of it. The second half of it has to do with spending. And so we took every appropriations bill, added up all the spending out of every single one of them, and then looked to see how much money each individual legislator voted against. And as you point out, the results are kind of interesting because, again, what you see is how these state legislators are actually voting as opposed to what they're saying. If you want to get a look at this report, go to policynd.org. They got a link right on their front page. You can check it out. They got top 5 lists. Plus, you can download and read the entire report. But just to be clear on this, what you've done is you've ranked them in 2 different ways. First of all, you picked out a number of bills that represented certain issues, transparency, limited government, things like that. And you ranked how they voted on those specific policy bills, and then you also ranked how they did on spending. That's fair? That's accurate? Yep, that's absolutely right, Rob. And we broke it down each chamber. So there's a Senate policy column, there's a Senate spending column, and a House policy column and a House spending column. So there's basically 4 columns of rankings, and just like you said, we separated the policy issues out from the spending issues, mostly because the spending issues can be a bit misleading. There are some things that are hard to account for when you just add up the spending, like I explained earlier. So this time we added in a policy element, which, like you said, took into account things like income tax cuts, some issues that we're dealing with Obamacare, government transparency, property rights, and those types of things to help even out some of the scores.
One of the criticisms, and this was in the Bismarck Tribune report about your study, one of the criticisms about this coming from legislators has to do with a specific spending ranking. And what they're saying is that a lot of the spending ranking, people vote for and against spending for a lot of reasons. Sometimes, they'll vote against the spending bill because it doesn't spend enough, which produces some strange results. And, one thing obviously was Democrat legislator, Senator David O'Connell, ranked the best in the Senate in voting against spending, ranking above Senate Majority Leader Bob Stenjum. Obviously, that's a little bit of a strange outcome, I guess. And does that speak to a problem in that metric?
Yes, it does. That is a problem with the analysis that we fully admit to. But I think it's important to understand what the numbers show and what they don't. The numbers show what they voted for and what they voted against. It does not take into account motivation, like you explained. If the human services budget didn't have this certain program that you wanted, you might vote against it. Not because the budget's too big, but just because maybe it wasn't enough or didn't have this particular program in it. So that can skew the spending numbers. So that was yet another reason why we included this policy element to it, which is more, I think it's based more on ideology and philosophy of government than it is based on just the strict, how you vote. And I think that definitely adds to our analysis. But the way I would answer that the criticism about that some of the state legislators made about this report is to say, look, if the House Majority Leader Al Carlson voted against less than 2% of all spending, forget what any other legislator voted for or against or how they compare to each other. The fact is that he voted against less than 2% of the spending, and he was one of the quoted legislators who was critical of this analysis. But again, if you just look at his votes alone, he voted for more money than first of all than any other House member. But just looking at him, he voted for over 98% of all the money. So in a way, I think what state legislators will do is they'll try to, at least some of the ones who think they're more conservative perhaps than they have voted, what they'll try to do is muddy the waters a little bit. It's just kind of politics as usual, I guess.
And then the point here, too, is that this should be the genesis for a discussion with your legislator. I mean, I do think that this is something that's been missing from the debate, the political debate here in North Dakota. And I know you guys did do it last year, but I like it even better this year because you did do the issues as well as just the spending. But basically, it's hard. Unless you're somebody who watches every day of the legislative session and can, dig through that maze that is the state's website for the legislature for voting, it's really hard to track relatively how these guys vote, whether they're voting conservatively or liberally or what have you. It's very hard to do, and this gives, I think, voters a very powerful measuring stick to go back and say, well, how is this specific legislator performing? Well, let's look at their ranking. But the word of caution, and I think this goes to maybe some of the concerns the legislators have, is don't just look at the ranking. Question your legislator, too. If you want to know why Al Carlson only voted against 2% of the spending, write him an email, give him a phone call, ask him, let him explain it to you, and then find out if his explanation, decide for yourself if his explanation is credible or not.
Yeah, Rob, that's an excellent point. And another thing I want everybody to understand is that this isn't, we don't want this analysis so much to be used as something to look back and pick at people and complain, as much as we want to know. As we talk about this Tea Party movement and the grassroots conservatives across the state and how things are starting to kind of come together, we want to know which state legislators are, tend to vote like we think, tend to think like us and vote like we'd want them to, and which ones don't. And this does that. Again, I don't want to pick on any certain particular legislator, and we certainly did not create a methodology designed to pick at any certain particular legislators. What we wanted to do was find out, generally speaking, if some of these state legislators are people that we think fiscal conservatives should support, and others, we might have to find or try to find replacements or work on them to vote more like us. And then the other thing is to look at big general trends. I mean, for instance. Of the 47 state senators, 41 of them voted against less than 10% of spending. What that tells
Brett, I hate to cut you off there. I hate to cut you off there, but we are up against the break. Got to go. PolicyND.org is a place to go for more information. Brett, thank you so much for being on the program. More of the Scott Hennon Show coming up straight ahead. Don't go away.